While we do expect the economy to grow in the long run, we also know that there are good times and bad times. And that's basically what the business cycle captures. So, one way we can think about the business cycle and to learn the terms we use about the business cycle is to imagine that there are times when the GDP is growing and life is good, but then it kind of turns down and then it starts to go back up. And this is the way you can visualize the business cycle. I'll show you in a second what it might look like in reality, but this works really well for picturing it and for getting the terms down. So we see here this graph of real GDP. We see GDP is growing, it hits a top, and then it starts to turn down. And we have a word for that. We have two words for this, actually. This period here where GDP is growing, we would call the expansion. And then it would hit a top, and we would call that the peak. And then after you hit the peak, we can see that GDP begins to turn down. That's what we call a recession. But it doesn't go down forever. At some point, it hits a bottom, and that's what we call trough. And after that, we start to see the expansion again. So those are the main terms of the business cycle we want to be familiar with. Basically, an expansion is the period of time between a trough, which was the bottoming out of the previous recession. So it's a time between a trough and the next peak. And then once you hit a peak, you begin to decline, and that's a recession. Now, the terms are pretty clear. The experience is not so clear. So when we actually are at a peak, the economy still feels pretty good. And even when we've begun the downturn, we don't usually feel it. You don't start to feel the unemployment set in immediately. You don't tend to feel the downturn in the value of the assets or whatever it is that's going to drive us down right away. And so often, even though we're in this part of the economy business cycle, even though we're technically in what they would call a recession, we don't necessarily feel it. And then similarly, when we're in a trough, even when we've begun to come up and it's been said that the recession is over and we're on an expansion, we don't necessarily feel it right away. But these are the terms that we use. And then the organization, this might be more than you need to know, but the organization that decides this is actually not government. It's a private organization that just started figuring out what they thought the dates of recessions were, the beginning and the end of recessions, and it's called the National Bureau of Economic Research. And somehow they just became the arbiters of this. And the only thing that's problematic about it is they have to do this information, the dating of the recessions and expansions, the troughs and the peaks. They have to do it retroactively because we simply don't have the data concurrently. So every time we are probably in the region of a peak or a trough, you will see a proliferation of articles written about, hey, is this the next recession? Or is the recession over? And the reason is because we don't really know for sure until sometime later when we kind of look back on it. All right, so I told you that this was going to be a good picture to have mentally for these terms, but it's not quite this cut and dried in the real world. The data makes things a little more unclear, I guess you would say. So this is what I was talking about. You still see that this point in time has been designated as a peak. So I'm not going to worry too much about this earlier area, but as we come into the peak, we do see this had been an expansion. And they're calling it the peak based on the various factors the NBER looks at. So what we see is that this technically is not the highest level of GDP, that in fact GDP had begun to fall. But they don't look just at GDP. They look at unemployment. They look at other factors. And so at some point in time, they decided that that was truly the peak of this expansion and that everything that came after that moment in time would truly be part of a recession. And so we do see this decline in GDP. It's just not quite so pronounced as my little idealized picture over here. And then at some point in time, things started to turn up. And sometime after it turned up, NBER decided that that was the trough, and that anything that would occur after that would be an expansion. There are occasional times in the real world where we have a kind of a double recession. So you do start to come out of your recession, and the NBER will say, we're not sure the economy is strong enough, to be a true big 10-year expansion period ahead, but we do think that anything that comes after this point in time should be dated an expansion. And so then if the economy were to falter, they would actually have two recessions very quickly. And that's one of the reasons why they're very particular about how they date this and how they do it. So they, using their knowledge and formula and whatever rubric they're using, they have come up with methods of saying, okay, as of this date, this expansion has ended, We are at a peak by definition. That's what a peak is. It's the end of the expansion. Everything that comes after it is a recession until we hit what the NBER designates as the trough, and then everything after that comes through the expansion. So that's just to have the lingo down for the business cycles. There's a few other things we want to be able to understand about what typically happens during a business cycle. We'll start with the easy one, the one you knew long before you walked into this classroom, which is as we hit a peak in the economy and start to have a recession, as we head towards the next trough, what happens to unemployment? Well, that's kind of one of the big characteristics of a recession is that unemployment rises. Now, we do tend to see it being a little bit of a lagging indicator. So earlier when I said that when we are at the peak and we're technically in recession, a lot of times we don't feel it because a lot of times we don't see the unemployment kick in at the beginning. But eventually the unemployment does kick in. Unemployment is much higher than normal. Much higher than the natural rate of unemployment for a period of time. And even as we hit the trough and start to come out, it takes a while for the unemployment to recover. That's what we mean by a lagging indicator. It's a little bit behind the peak and it doesn't start to improve until you get a little bit beyond the trough. But in general, that's what you see. You have a recession, unemployment rises. Another characteristic, which is already shown here because of what we're using is real GDP, is generally a drop in GDP is characteristic of a recession. It is a little more complicated than that, as we saw in the previous graph that was a little less clear, but in general, a declining or a slowing GDP will be part of a recession. And then the third thing will be inflation. As we get into the model of the economy next chapter, we'll be able to show that how inflation acts during a recession can actually be two different things. But speaking first of all just of a typical recession, what we tend to see is as we move from a peak towards a trough, as we go through a recession, in general what we tend to see is inflation falls. A typical recession sees a cutback in consumption, a cutback therefore in production, obviously as we've said, a drop in employment or a rise in unemployment, and therefore just kind of a general slowing of the economy. So prices don't have pressure on them to continue to rise. So in a typical recession, you'll see inflation fall. There is a type of recession that's called a supply shock that we learn next chapter, where you can actually see inflation rise as GDP falls, as unemployment rises. So that's a really bad thing as far as our policymakers are concerned, because they don't have a good policy to fix it. And specifically, that is a term called stagflation. And stagflation is when you have rising unemployment and rising prices, rising inflation as well. So a typical recession is not stagflation. Typical recession sees that unemployment is going up while inflation goes down. But this other type of shock to the economy we'll learn about next chapter does see this really bad combination, because you don't need to see prices rising when you're unemployed. The last thing I want to say about the business cycle is one more concept called durable and non-durable goods. In general, durable goods are goods that are thought to last for 3 or more years, whereas non-durable goods would be all other goods, goods that don't last that long. And so the concept here is that a durable good is something more like a car or a washing machine, something you don't buy all the time. And so when times get bad, you start cutting back, something you can afford to cut back on more is the durable goods. You get things repaired instead of replace them, that sort of thing. And so what we tend to see is that for the goods that are considered durable goods, the ones that are long-lasting, they tend to be way more volatile in their consumption patterns, that when we have a recession, they fall a lot. And when we have an expansion, that's when they rise a lot. So you're going to see more volatility in consumption through the business cycle if you sell durable goods. And if you sell a non-durable good, you might still see some fall off during recession, but if it's gone, if you've used it up, If it wears out in less than 3 years, you can only put off your purchasing of it so long. An extreme example of non-durable goods, of course, would be food. You're not going to cut back on your food extremely during a recession, so you'll see a much more tempered pattern of consumption. So that's just probably one more thing to understand about how we can recognize what's happening in the economy as we move through the business cycle, how things will react, what things will typically be like as we go through the business cycle. So going on from here, we'll be creating the model of macroeconomics, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, which will allow us to model things like these short-run economic fluctuations, the business cycle, as well as understand how the economy tends towards its long-run GDP, its potential GDP.